We began our mission on Sunday with the Sunday Masses, and remember the first reading gave us the Ten Commandments, God's law, and we said that Jesus simplified those, or summed them up really, by saying they come down to two: love God and love your neighbor. And that's really the Eucharist. We gather to show our love for God, to worship God, to honor God. And then that sends us forth to be the body of Christ in the world, to care for one another, to love our neighbor. Jesus is the one who offered perfect obedience and worship to the Father. Remember, in the Old Testament times, the priests would offer sacrifices. And the sacrifices they would offer would be dead animals that they would place on the altar, or maybe cereal or grain offerings. They would put them on the altar, set them ablaze, and the smoke ascending to God represented the people and their prayers. Well, Jesus came and replaced all those old sacrificial offerings with his one perfect offering that reconciles the world to God the Father. His obedience and sacrificial love were the perfect act of worship. And as we've said throughout our mission, now Jesus makes that perfect act of worship present to us. And we, as his body, offer ourselves with him to the Father. And then we live that offering in our daily lives. That's the basic law that God has given us. And remember, it's not something imposed from outside, but it's part of our nature. That we're made in the image and likeness of God. And so we're made to love God and to love our neighbor. And the letter to the Romans, chapter 12, speaks of our lives as a sacrificial offering. Here's what St. Paul wrote to the Romans, chapter 12. I urge you, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. So our worship means offering ourselves with Christ. And when we say bodies, we're speaking of our living body and soul together are offered to God. Now, it's been said that there's one big problem with a living sacrifice. You know what that is? It can crawl off the altar. We might offer ourselves with Jesus to the Father, but then take the offering back and go out and live our lives as though we do not love God and love our neighbor, that we do not offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. So, this is where living the Eucharist in our daily lives comes into play. Yesterday we talked about how we celebrate the Eucharist. And now I'd like to ask the question, how can you tell that there has been a good liturgy, a good Eucharistic celebration? How can you tell that it's been good? Now, we might think, well, if I feel good, if I feel God's presence, or if I feel a sense of community. But feelings are not always a good indication of what's really going on. We so often judge how we're doing with how we're feeling. We judge our prayer based on whether or not we're feeling consolation and peace. But St. John of the Cross, the great Carmelite, taught that often our lives involve a dark night, an emptiness, a desert. And we shouldn't judge our prayer based on how we feel. Because sometimes God allows those dark nights, those empty periods, in order to purify us, to purify our intention. In other words, often we're tempted to hold on to the feeling and to seek the consolation rather than the God who gives the consolation. And so God is often purifying us and our motives and our intentions. And we shouldn't judge our celebration on how we feel, but we should judge it on the effects in our daily life. Remember, we said we gather, and we gather not just as physical bodies who are here like a passive audience, but we have to plug into the celebration in order to allow the grace and the transformation to take place, to give us a new heart. And in fact, this is what St. John Paul and Pope Benedict also said with regards to how we judge our Eucharistic celebrations. In his letter announcing the year of the Eucharist, Pope John Paul II said this. He was hoping that during the year of the Eucharist, he said, we, our communities, would commit themselves to responding to one of the many forms of poverty in our world. And then he said, I think, for example, of hunger, which plagues millions, hundreds of millions of human beings, the diseases which afflict developing countries, the loneliness of the elderly, feeling abandoned, alone, apart from community, the hardships faced by the unemployed, the struggles of immigrants. He says, we cannot delude ourselves by our mutual love, and in particular by our concern for those in need. We will be recognized as true followers of Christ. This will be the criterion by which the authenticity of our Eucharistic celebrations is judged. Those are very strong words. He's saying, how do we judge whether or not our celebration has been authentic? By whether or not we love one another. Pope Benedict said a similar thing. He was talking to a Congress, a meeting in Rome, a diocesan conference. And in his address to them in 2010, Pope Benedict said, the Eucharist celebrated obliges us and at the same time enables us. I would use the word empowers us. That's what he's talking about. The Eucharist celebrated empowers us to become, in our turn, bread broken for our brothers and sisters, meeting their needs and giving ourselves. For this reason, he says, a Eucharistic celebration that does not lead to meeting people where they live, work, and suffer in order to bring them God's love does not express the truth it contains. Again, those are very strong words. He's basically saying that if we gather to celebrate and then go out and don't bring God's love to the people who most need it, then our celebration has been a lie, a falsehood. It has not contained the truth that is there, God's love transforming us. Then he says this, in order to be faithful to the mystery that is celebrated on the altars, we must, as the Apostle Paul exhorts us, offer our bodies, ourselves, as a spiritual sacrifice pleasing to God, in those circumstances that ask us to make our I, now he's not talking about, our eyes, but our I, me, to make our I die, and that constitute our daily altar. In other words, what we celebrate on this altar is lived out in the altar of our daily lives, where we are called to lay down our lives for one another, to love one another, even when it hurts, with a giving rather than trying to get attitude. So, this is how Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, spoke about the effect of the Eucharist and living the Eucharist in our daily lives. Let me put it another way. When I was studying theology in preparation for my ordination, I was in the Boston area, and Sister Dorothy Welch was my supervisor for my field education, where I went into hospitals or nursing homes and brought the love of St. Anne's Parish in Somerville, Massachusetts. I brought her love, the love of that parish, to the people there. And I'll never forget something Sister Dorothy told me, and I hope you will remember this as well. It's very simple. She said, if we are not bread for one another, it's all baloney. That's easy to remember. If we are not bread for one another, it's all baloney. That was Sister Dorothy Welch. Now, what does that mean to be bread broken for one another? I want to tell you a few stories. What, in your mind, is one of the greatest love stories? Now, of course, we would say the story of God's love for us. But thinking for a moment about a love story. When you hear that expression, love story, don't you think of that novel and the movie with Ali McGraw? And we think of romance, right? We think of something romantic. But I want to tell you about a movie that I think was one of the greatest love stories ever filmed. Some years ago, it was actually in March of 2002, I was working at a Jesuit retreat house in Minnesota. And Sunday night, the retreat was over, we were up in our little living room watching television, and there was a movie that came on that we watched. And it was an interesting movie because it was a documentary. And it was a French film crew deciding to film a day in the life of an average fire company in New York City. And they were going to follow one of the probationary firemen who was there and just get his reactions to things. So they began filming this. The thing is, the day they chose to film a day in the life, an average day in the life of a fire company, a rescue squad, first responders, the day they chose to do that was no ordinary day. It was September 11th, 2001. And they filmed this, and the title of the film, you can look this up, is 9/11. What I remember is they were filming the men talking, bantering, and whatnot, and then the alarm comes, and they race to the World Trade Center. They hear, well, a plane has struck the World Trade Center, and they go to rescue people, to put out the fire. Well, the second plane hits. They set up a command center in the middle between the two buildings. They have not fallen yet. And what do these rescue people do? Because the elevators are out, they start climbing the stairs. What do you think they felt as they were doing that? I don't think they felt a lot of gushy romantic feelings that we associate with love. They probably felt a lot of fear. But that's what first responders do. They respond to the need. And so, out of a sense of duty, this is what we do. They climb those stairs and sacrificed their lives trying to save others. Do you see why I think that's one of the greatest love stories that was ever filmed? Because it's not that kind of romantic love that we associate with love, how we're feeling, but it's about what we do. And sometimes love has a lot to do with duty rather than feeling. I was talking about this at one of those retreats in Minnesota, and after I spoke about this, one of the retreatants came up to me, He introduced himself. His name was Vince Fonlander. And he said to me, "I was Tom Burnett's college roommate." I had to think for a moment. Tom Burnett, that name sounds familiar, but I'm not so sure. Well, he went on to say Tom Burnett was on that plane that crashed in the field in Shankville, Pennsylvania. He was one of the group that said, "Let's roar." And he told me how he had lost touch with Tom, who had moved to California and was working for a medical technology firm. And that shortly after the events of 9/11, he was getting his hair cut in the St. Paul area, Minnesota. And the barbers and people were talking about Tom Burnett and what a hero he was. And Vin said, "Tom Burnett? He was my college roommate at St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota." Well, they had a memorial service for him back in Minnesota at St. Edward's Parish in Bloomington. And Vince went to the memorial service. He went up to Dina Burnett, Tom's wife, and introduced himself, the roommate. And he said, "You know, as the priest was talking about Tom, I have to admit, I thought maybe I was in the wrong place." Because the priest was talking about a guy who went to Mass every day. And that's not the Tom Burnett I remember from college. He had pretty much quit the practice of the faith. And Dina said yes, for a while he had. And she said, but it was interesting. In 1997, he had stopped coming home for lunch. Where he worked was close enough that he could come home and share lunch with his wife, Dina, and little children. And in 97, he had quit coming back. And she thought, well, he was such a hard worker, he was probably putting in extra hours in the office. 6 months before September 11th, 2001, 6 months before his death, Tom Burnett told Dina that over all those years, he'd been going to daily Mass. And here's how he explained it. She talked about this in an interview. He told me that he felt God was telling him he was going to do something big. But he didn't understand what it was. He reasoned that if he went to Mass, he might find out what was in store for him. So you see, for years, he has this sense, God is calling me to something. And it's going to have an impact on a lot of people. But I don't know what that is. Maybe if I go to Mass, I'll find out. The Lord will show me what I am to do with my life. Then Dina Burnett said this. Listen to this. He knew that what he was going to do would impact a lot of people. And he knew one other thing. It had something to do with the White House. Now, imagine this average guy working for a medical technology firm in California, feeling his life has a purpose and a meaning, and somehow what he's going to be called to do has something to do with the White House. And he's thinking, what does my life have to do with the White House? I have no intention of going into politics, of becoming president. What does my life have to do with the White House? Well, on September 11th, 2001, thousands of feet above the earth, Tom Burnett knew what his life had to do with the White House. And he and the others knew where that plane, which had turned around over Pennsylvania, where it was headed. And they knew they had to do something, even if it meant losing their lives in the process. And that's what happened. Now, we call people like Tom Burnett heroes. And they are. They are heroes. But I would propose to you, all of us are called to heroic love. It might not be something that makes the newspapers. It might be as simple as caring for a spouse with Alzheimer's. It might be as simple as caring for a child with special needs. And no one's ever going to read about it. But every time we love, where we say, this I, this ego that's concerned mostly about itself is going to die on this daily altar in which I'm called to love my neighbor, especially maybe someone who it's difficult to love. Whenever we do that, we are loving heroically the way Jesus did, the way these people that we call heroes do. So often our lives, which seem maybe so little, so inconsequential, we need to see our lives in a different way. That every precious moment of our lives, when it's joined to Jesus' perfect offering, can bring about great good in the world. Let me give you another example. Saint Therese of Lisieux. She was 12 years old when she joined what's known as the Apostleship of Prayer. For 14 years I was the national director of the Apostleship of Prayer. And one of the things we promoted was the daily offering prayer, in which we begin the day offering Jesus all our prayers, works, joys, and sufferings. And in that way we try to make our life a prayer. We try to live the offering we make at Mass in our daily lives. Well, when she was 12 years old, St. Therese of Lisieux joined the Apostleship of Prayer. And I think that's where she learned this spirituality, the little way, of faith and trust and offering herself to the Lord. When she was about 13 and a half years old, she was in the cathedral in Lisieux, France, St. Peter's Cathedral. I was there on a pilgrimage a few years ago, and they even have a little plaque in the side altar where she was praying. She had a picture of Jesus on the cross. And looking at this picture as she was praying, she was concerned because the blood from his hands was dropping to the ground. And she wanted to go and in her mind, spiritually, catch that blood and then pour it out on souls, on people who were in need. Here's what she writes in her autobiography. The cry of Jesus on the cross sounded continually in my heart. I thirst. These words ignited within me a living fire. I wanted to give my beloved to drink, and I felt myself consumed with a thirst for souls. Traditionally we hear those words, yes, Jesus thirsted physically on the cross, but it's also as though he's saying, this is how much I love you. Will you accept my love? Will you draw near to me and let me love you? I thirst for you and your love. And so Therese wanted to take away that thirst of Jesus, to be known and to be loved. And she targeted people that she felt were at risk of not knowing the love of God or of rejecting it and being alienated from God forever. And the first person she targeted with her prayers was a man by the name of Henri Pranzini. He had murdered 2 women and a young girl in the course of a robbery. This even made the newspapers in the United States. And everything pointed to the fact that he was unrepentant, bitter, angry, would not see a priest. He was sentenced to death, and the instrument of execution in France in the 1880s was the guillotine. And Therese started praying for him and offering sacrifices for him. She might skip dessert as a prayer, a sacrifice. She might have been told to do something unpleasant, some chore that she didn't like to do, and she would procrastinate and put off doing it. But instead, she would do it right away out of love for God and as a prayer for Henri Pranzini. Well, the day of his execution came and went. And Therese had to find out what happened. Had he seen a priest? But she had one big problem. Her father had forbidden his children from reading the newspaper. He didn't think that the material in the newspaper was appropriate for his daughters. So what was she going to do? Listen to how she puts it in her autobiography. In spite of Papa's prohibition that we read no papers, I didn't think I was disobeying when reading the passages pertaining to Pranzini. Now I'll leave it to you parents to decide whether or not you think she was being disobedient. You see, she said, I'm not going to read the whole paper. Papa said we can't do that, but I just got to read this little section here about Pranzini. And here's what she read. Pranzini had not gone to confession. He had mounted the scaffold and was preparing to place his head in the formidable opening when suddenly, seized by an inspiration, he turned, took hold of the crucifix the priest was holding out to him, and kissed the sacred wounds 3 times. Then his soul went to receive the merciful sentence of him who declares that in heaven there will be more joy over one sinner who does penance than over 99 just who have no need of repentance. Therese was convinced that her prayers and sacrifices had played a role in that last second act of repentance. And she called Pranzini my first child. Now, does that sound familiar to you? That kind of spirituality of offering. You know, growing up on the south side of Milwaukee, St. Paul's grade school, if something happened that we didn't like, we fell on the playground, we were crying over in the corner, we were being naughty, and Sister Domitil said, you have to stay after school and clean the erasers. I don't know what they do now, but maybe clean the whiteboard. At any rate, we would be moping in the corner or crying, and Sister Domitil would come over to us and she would say 3 words. Do you know what those 3 words were? I think I heard it. Offer it up. Offer it up. You know, I was once giving a parish mission in Parisville, Michigan, and I got to that point and it was dead silence. No one knew. And finally the organist took a guess. He said, suck it up. And I said, no. Sister Domitil would not say, suck it up. Now, you know, maybe we used that expression, offer it up, as kind of a Catholic way of saying, come on, kid, get over it. But the idea behind it is really quite beautiful. It's a reminder to us that when suffering comes our way, when the cross comes our way, we can join it to Jesus' cross, to his perfect offering at Mass. And we can offer it for particular intentions. And those prayers and sacrifices will have an effect. Now, we tend to give up. You know, we like instant results. People say, I pray, I pray, I pray. God doesn't hear my prayers. What? You think God is hearing impaired? I pray, I pray, I pray. God does not answer my prayers. No, God answers every prayer, but it may not be the answer we want. Remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane? Remember his prayer, Father, take this cup from me? And what was the answer he received? No. This is the only way we can prove to the world how much we love them. And so Jesus prayed, not my will, but yours be done. So, in our lives, we have to have faith. Faith that our prayers and sacrifices make a difference. St. Paul talked about this in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 24. He said, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church. Now, many of our non-Catholic Christian brothers and sisters don't understand, what does that mean? Is Paul saying that the sufferings of Jesus on the cross were not sufficient to take away the sin of the world? Paul would never say that. What he's saying is this: Christ died and saved the world. But not everybody in the world knows that, nor has everyone accepted that love and been saved. And so they are at risk. And our prayers now, as members of the body of Christ, play a significant part in the ongoing work of salvation. You could say the one thing lacking in the sufferings of Christ on behalf of his body, the church, is our own participation in them. And that doesn't mean you have to go looking for suffering. There's plenty in everyone's life. But when it comes our way, we have a choice. We can slip into self-pity. We can slip into despair and anger at God and other people. Or we can turn that pain, that suffering, into a very powerful prayer. Now, don't take my word for it. Let's listen to Pope Francis. In his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, he said, we have to have faith. We have to believe that our lives have a purpose. Even when we're at the end of our lives, even if we're in a nursing home bed and are unable to get up or even say a word, even then our life has purpose, because we can offer our lives like Jesus did on the cross. Our cross is that bed. And that prayerful offering can make wonderful things happen in our world. Remember, Jesus, in his earthly life, at times could not work certain miracles. In Matthew chapter 6, we read, it's Mark chapter 6. We read that Jesus came to his hometown of Nazareth and was rejected. And the scripture says he was not able to work many miracles there because of their lack of faith. So we have to pray and live our lives with faith that God has a plan for us and is using our sacrificial love to do things in the world. Here's how Pope Francis put it. Because we do not always see the results of our prayers, we don't see change maybe, we need an interior certainty, a conviction that God is able to act in every situation, even amid setbacks. He goes on, we can know quite well that our lives will be fruitful without claiming to know how or where or when. We may be sure that none of our acts of love will be lost, nor any of our acts of sincere concern for others. No single act of love for God will be lost. No painful endurance is wasted. Now I hear in those words, painful endurance, offer it up. He says, all of these encircle our world like a vital force. And it may be that God, he says, uses our prayers and sacrifices to touch someone in another part of the world that we will never visit. Then, Pope Francis, on the World Day of the Sick, Our Lady of Lourdes feast day, this was in 2016, he talked about Cana. And he said, we have to be like those servants at Cana. Jesus could have made that wine from nothing. The empty jars, he could have just filled them with wine using his divine power. But he invites our cooperation. And he asked those men to come and fill those jars. Now they could have said, we don't need that water anymore. We've already had the purification rite. We don't need that water. But they obediently responded to Jesus, and they filled the jars to the brim. Here's how Pope Francis reflected on this. He said, "We too can be the hands, arms, and hearts which help God to perform his miracles, so often hidden. We too, whether healthy or sick, can offer up our toil and sufferings, like the water which filled the jars and was turned into the finest wine." He says, if we do this, he says, Jesus will always change the water of our lives into precious wine. Lives that seem so ordinary, hidden, in Jesus' hands become something divine. Now, I want to conclude with a thought. I want you to imagine for a moment Saint Therese at the end of her life. You know, she died of tuberculosis at the age of 24, and they say she had only perhaps 1/3 of a lung that could still breathe, and so it was a painful, suffocating kind of death. And imagine for a moment, she passes from this life to the next. The way I imagine it is, there's a big crowd of people waiting to welcome her. And right in the front are Louis and Zélie, her parents. A few years back, they were the first married couple in history to be canonized together. There had been others who were beatified, but they were the first to be canonized. And they were right in the front. But the way I imagine it is, there's this guy, and he's way in the back of the crowd. And I don't know if you can do this, but I imagine him pushing himself forward. Okay? And he gets right to the front, and he turns to Louis and Zélie, and he says, please let me be the first. And they're startled. They have no idea who this guy is. But as Therese crosses the threshold, he goes up to her, and he says, Therese, thank you. I wouldn't have made it without you. My name is Henri Pranzini. And with that, she's welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. It makes sense that her first child would be the first one to welcome her. And that's the thought I want to leave you with. All of our lives are important to God and God's plan and God's work. In very many hidden ways, we're called to love. And one of the great joys of heaven will be seeing how our prayers, our offerings, our sacrifices played a role in helping other people come to the kingdom of heaven. And we will have one big party when we see that.